On July 10, 2024, Carnegie Council President Joel Rosenthal hosted a special roundtable discussion in conversation with Tufts University's Professor Abiodun Williams. They discussed Williams' latest book, Kofi Annan and Global Leadership at the United Nations. You'll first hear from Joel Rosenthal.
Thank you all for coming and sharing this summer evening with us. We sort of do less programming in the summer at the council, like many places in New York City. This is inspired by one of my favorite quotes from Henry James, the novelist. And he said, the two most beautiful words in the English language are summer afternoon. So I never want to mess with summer afternoon. But summer evening is perfect. And it's perfect for an event like this. And this is actually, we meant this to be informal, conversational, and it will be that. But there is a certain formality to this event. Abi just reminded me that this is actually a book launch. We have something to celebrate, and it should be a formal occasion. So we're delighted to have the opportunity to do this in person, in real life, with you, Abi. So that's the sort of spirit of our conversation this evening. Most of you know Abi's been a great friend of Carnegie Council for many years, maybe more years than we wish to count. But Abi, I think I first met you when you were just starting out at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. And it was really good to be reconnected with you last October at Global Ethics Day when we had a very memorable event right here in this room. And Abi, you were the perfect guest on a very sort of difficult and challenging day. This was just a couple of weeks after October 7th. And there was, real despair about the tragic events. And you sort of helped encourage us and gave us some inspiration of how to deal with that. So thank you belatedly for that. For those of you meeting Abi for the first time, he is professor of the practice of international diplomacy at the Fletcher School. And as his title indicates, he's both a scholar and practitioner, having held leadership positions at the United Nations, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the Hague Institute for Global Justice. I know we circulated in advance Abi's latest article in our journal, Ethics and International Affairs. The title is Order with Justice: The Challenge of Global Governance. And I think the title itself suggests the main themes of Abi's work. But the featured element this evening is Abi's new book. We have it in hand. Looks great.
Thank you.
Kofi Annan and Global Leadership of the United Nations, just published by Oxford University Press. And in this book, Abi highlights the key characteristics of both ethics and leadership, which we can see through the life and achievements of Kofi Annan. Abi had the opportunity to serve closely with Kofi Annan as Director of Strategic Planning in the early 2000s. Reflecting on that experience some years later, we believe there are some lessons that are relevant to today. So congratulations on the publication of the book. Thank you for agreeing to talk about it with us this evening. So let's get to it. As a way to lead off the conversation, I thought maybe since we're at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, we could start by talking a little bit about Kofi Annan's ethical framework, how he thought about the concept of ethics and how it informed his view of the world.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you very much, Joe, for the kind invitation and for the very warm words of welcome and introduction. As I say, we've known each other a very long time, and it's nice to be reconnected with you last October. And of course, it's a great pleasure to be back at the Carnegie Council. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. And thank you, all of you, for coming out on a nice, hot summer day in New York City. And it's nice to be back, actually, particularly to talk about this book, about Kofi Annan and global leadership at the United Nations, because I lived in New York and worked at the UN, and this is the first in-person discussion I'm having since the book came out. So it's a great pleasure to be here. You asked about Kofi Annan's ethical framework. Annan's moral convictions were central to his conception of the Secretary-Generalship and of his responsibilities as Secretary-General. The day after his appointment as Secretary-General, he was asked at a press conference to define his new job. And in response to the question from one of the UN correspondents, Annan said that the Secretary-General has administrative, political, diplomatic roles, and, he added, above all, a moral voice that should be heard periodically when necessary. And throughout his tenure as Secretary-General, that moral voice was heard as he used the bully pulpit as the communicator general, which is what I call him in the book. So the communicator general used the bully pulpit of the Secretary-Generalship to use that moral voice to exhort, to persuade, to inspire, and to make a difference in the world. Annan's ethical framework was influenced by his family, his education, and religion. He was born in Ghana in 1938, and he was the son of a provincial governor and the grandson of two paramount chiefs. So he grew up with a great reverence for public service, and virtue was grounded in service. So public service and duty were two essential elements of his ethical framework. Annan was also educated at the prestigious boarding school in Fanzipim in Cape Coast in Ghana, which was founded by the Methodist Church in the 19th century. And he said that his education was infused with a moral purpose. And he was taught in the spirit of faith that suffering anywhere concerns people everywhere. Okay. So the alleviation of human suffering was also an essential pillar of his ethical framework. So I think the commitment to public service, duty, and the alleviation of human suffering were three fundamental pillars of his ethical framework.
That's great. By the way, this is going to be an open conversation, so I'm just telling you now, and I'm willing to ask the first few questions, but then I'm going to stop. So I want you to join in. But I wasn't going to go there, but you mentioned the Methodist school, but also his family background. So was there a religious component that you saw later in his life that would be part of his sort of professional world, or was it sort of a private matter for him?
Yes, Annan was very private about his religious views. It wasn't something he talked frequently about, although he did, as in that example which I gave, where it was one of the rare occasions when he talked about the influence of education and the religious dimension to that education. He was actually an Anglican, but his family was Anglican, but he went to school in a Methodist school. It was one of the rare occasions of it. But it was certainly reflected in his policy priorities and his actions as Secretary-General.
So that's what I was going to move to, and I just wanted to underline that. It's a great phrase. Suffering anywhere concerns people everywhere. It's kind of interesting. So thinking about how that ethical framework informed his political agenda, how he thought about politics, and maybe you could highlight a couple of the main themes, whether it's human rights or some. I'll let you choose, because I know there's a sort of a portfolio of political commitments that he had.
Well, Kofi Annan's ethical framework undoubtedly shaped his actions and his policy priorities as Secretary-General. So, for example, in terms of human rights, he was very different from his predecessors. He was the seventh Secretary-General of the UN, the first, of course, to have come through the ranks of the organization, because all his predecessors, and in fact his two successors, have always come from outside the UN. We can talk about that in the discussion. But he was different from his predecessors because he sought to exercise global leadership on human rights. And while propitious geopolitical circumstances provided the context for his efforts, notably the end of the Cold War, his moral values, his moral convictions impelled him to seize the opportunity. And so, in terms of human rights, he believed that human rights were the very heart of the UN's mission, and he saw the promotion and the protection of human rights as a way to advance human dignity. He firmly believed that human rights were universal, and they were inseparable. And so he pushed the UN to begin to think about human rights in the various parts of its work, and to mainstream human rights in the work of the organization. It was also one of the reasons, I should also say that human rights for him were also important because not only did human rights have an intrinsic importance for him, but they were also important in terms of achieving other critical goals. So he thought you really could not achieve the alleviation of poverty or deal with the prevention of conflict if you ignored human rights. So it was both intrinsic, but it also helped you to do certain other critical things. And it was also part of the reason why he championed the establishment of the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council, which was established in 2006 and replaced the discredited Human Rights Commission, because he felt that the framers and the founders of the UN had set up these two councils, the Security Council, which has primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, and you have ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council. But there was a gap in the institutional structure of the UN, and he felt that if you have a Human Rights Council, that would elevate, of course, human rights institutionally and give it its rightful place in the UN. And he also tried to get the Security Council to begin to consider human rights in their discussions and in their decisions. So certainly in terms of human rights, another good example would be his global leadership on HIV/AIDS. Annan led the global fight on HIV/AIDS, driven by ethical concern. When he became Secretary-General, thousands of people were dying each day around the world. In Africa alone, in 1999, 5,500 Africans were dying each day from HIV/AIDS. So Annan felt that he had a moral responsibility to highlight the human and the economic and the social costs of HIV/AIDS, and also to use his moral voice to begin to end what he called the conspiracy of silence, which led to great discrimination and stigma surrounding HIV/AIDS. And so because of his global leadership and his advocacy, that led to the establishment of the Global Fund to combat HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And he then used his convening power to bring together the CEOs of the leading pharmaceutical companies. Starting in a first meeting in Amsterdam, he had a series of meetings to convince the CEOs of pharmaceutical companies that they had to make antiretroviral drugs affordable in developing countries, because the cost of treatment was about $12,000, $1999. And so these antiretroviral drugs were not affordable. And so he pushed and he persuaded the CEOs to make them at affordable prices. And millions of people are alive today because Kofi Annan provided robust and ethical leadership at a very critical time during the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And one third example would be, of course, his leadership on the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs. He was the architect of the MDGs, which for the first time, you had 8 goals, which provided a common framework for the international community, embraced by member states, by donors, developing countries, the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions. And the MDGs, he sought not to move attention, not merely from market-oriented and macroeconomic phenomena, but to turn attention to the human aspects of development, poverty, hunger, environmental protection. And because of his leadership on the MDGs paved the way for the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, the 17, which we now have today. And we would not have had the SDGs without the ethical and robust leadership which Annan demonstrated with the Millennium Development Goals. So I think those 3 examples, both his work on human rights, his effort and leadership on HIV/AIDS and on MDGs, illustrate the ethical foundations of his leadership.
Those are great. I'm going to open up in a minute. I'll ask one more question.
Okay.
Just the last one I'm going to have. So this goes to the sort of leadership question, right? This where I apologize in advance for the old joke about secretary or general, right? Is the leader more secretary or more general? But I'm interested in your kind of reflection on this as we look at the case of Kofi Annan in terms of his leadership style, because as you were describing his accomplishments there, which were really quite monumental in these 3 areas, it would seem to me, though, his challenge was sort of making a case, was sort of rallying support, raising consciousness and rallying support. But I'm wondering, he must have had also enemies, in other words, people who did not agree with his agenda, or, so it wasn't just trying to identify an issue, rally support, and then move out. I'm just curious, what was some of the challenges that were sort of pushing back on his leadership?
Well, I think the interesting thing about this unique job of Secretary-General, most people will make the mistake and think the UN Secretary-General is a head of state and a head of government. But the UN Secretary-General has no political power in the conventional sense. The Secretary-General controls no territory. The Secretary-General commands no armies. He or she cannot levy taxes. And so you have to use other tools for leadership. And in terms of Annan, it was the moral authority of the position, which grew over the years. And the moral authority of the position could make a huge difference in trying to move the global agenda. He was also, as I said earlier on, quite skillful in using the bully pulpit. And he would choose occasions for talking about particular issues, and the bully pulpit he could use to exhort, to change, to persuade, and to give others a voice if he felt that this was necessary. Annan, it was very difficult, of course, not to like Kofi Annan. And he had very few enemies because he had certain qualities about him. Kofi Annan was courteous. He was incredibly patient. He was a person of great honesty, integrity, and moral courage. And I think all of the qualities that he had, and tremendous empathy as well, made it easy for heads of state, world leaders to trust him and to get along with him, and to help others, to bring people around. When I gave the example of these CEOs and trying to persuade them to make the cost of antiretroviral drugs affordable, he essentially shamed them in a very quiet, Annan way. And shame proved more powerful than profit. And I would always also say that finally, in terms of bringing people around, he had a wonderful sense of humor. And his wonderful, wry sense of humor could ease the most difficult policy discussions. And he would use and deploy his sense of humor to really disarm even potential adversaries. Mm-hmm. So I think all of those qualities were very effective in being Secretary-General, which, as I said, a post which would not have political power, does not have political power in the conventional sense.
Right. George.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor, for taking the time to talk to us. I feel really humbled.
Call me Abby.
Okay. I feel really humbled because I believe we share similar descent in terms of nationality from Sierra Leone. I can reference that, but also in terms of the person we are talking about, I believe Kofi Annan inspired my own diplomatic journey. I initially thought I'm going to go to the law firm, or I went to law school and all of that, but I was also interested in diplomacy. I have read most of his books or statements that are out there. I think it's really important to see that all of that come alive in your presentation of him and things like that. So just following on the theme of human rights, I think my question is, in what ways can Kofi Annan's advocacy for human rights and sustainable development, because I believe it was really big on those here. You know, you mentioned the MDGs, HIV, and poverty alleviation. I think those were some of the big bucket agenda that he really rallied around and championed. So in what ways can we use that as a guide for today's leadership, emerging leaders or current world leaders, in promoting peace and stability amidst global challenges, particularly humanitarian challenges? Think about Sudan, think about Yemen, we think about Syria, we think about Chad, so many. In what ways can we reference that and really bring it to light? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the question, George. I think in terms of human rights, one of the most controversial issues in international diplomacy, and the bed of nails for Secretaries-General and High Commissioners of Human Rights. But Annan, as I said, was convinced about the centrality of human rights in terms of the UN's work. And in terms of his vision for the UN, he saw the cardinal mission of the UN, peace and security, development, and human rights, as inextricably linked, that you could not have peace and security without development. You could not have development without peace and security. And you wouldn't have either without human rights. And in its first wave of reforms, it made human rights a cross-cutting issue within the organization. And so the High Commissioner for Human Rights was made a member of each of the executive committees that he set up in the first wave of reforms. Interestingly, I think also he saw a connection between human rights and democracy, because he felt that democracy, with all its flaws and imperfections, was also very critical and useful in trying to promote human rights. He was too much of a realist to embrace one ideal form of democracy, but he felt that that would help to promote human rights, which is why he pushed for the establishment of the UN Democracy Fund. He also saw the prevention of conflict, armed conflict, as critical for the pursuance of human rights, because human rights are always greatly threatened, abandoned when you have conflict. So I think putting emphasis on the prevention and the alleviation of conflict also help the promotion of human rights.
I'm going to jump in right here again, because I'm curious. One of the things we had discussed prior, and I think would be important for this conversation, was how he dealt with failures, right? So, human rights is a great aspiration, but you're almost, destined to come up short. And I'm sure many of us are feeling that in our work today, right? It seems sort of we're moving sort of against the wind in some ways. So I'm sure there were various moments of acknowledged failure, but also sort of ongoing failures as well. I'm thinking primarily in sort of R2P in that area. This idea that sort of conflicts grind on, and we see some notable failures. Any great leader has to figure out how to deal with that. I'm curious what came out in the book in that regard.
Well, when Kofi Annan was Under Secretary-General, he was Under Secretary-General for peacekeeping operations for a few years before he became Secretary-General. And while he was Under Secretary for peacekeeping operations, he saw that the international community failed to respond to Rwanda and the genocide in Rwanda. That the international community failed to respond to Srebrenica and in former Yugoslavia. And then while he was Secretary General, he saw what happened in Kosovo, which really also cast a shadow on the United Nations, because action was taken by NATO to stop Milosevic carrying out atrocities in Kosovo, but did not go through the Security Council because the action would have been faced with inevitable vetoes from at least two of the permanent members. So those experiences had an impact on him as Secretary General. And as a leader, good leaders and all leaders make mistakes. What Kofi did and how he responded, first you have an acknowledgement of what has happened. You apologize for what has happened, and then you try to do something about what has happened. And that's how he responded. And that is the genesis of the responsibility to protect, because he then made a series of speeches, both outside the UN and at the opening of the General Assembly, usually in September, very hard-hitting speeches, where he challenged the member states and the international community, particularly the guardians of sovereignty, that they had to find a way to deal with mass atrocities. And he was a quintessential non-entrepreneur when he was challenging the world that we have to find a way to deal with mass atrocities. And he firmly believed that sovereignty should not be a shield behind which you should hide a shield for mass atrocities, and that sovereignty exists to protect people and cannot be used as a justification for committing mass atrocities. And that is what led, of course, to the responsibility to protect, which he called his most precious achievement.
Jim, you had your hand up.
Yeah, and you touched on one of the things I was going to ask about, but I'll see if you can expand on it. So I was thinking about Kosovo and circumvention of the Security Council by NATO, and it was just making me think more broadly that every Secretary-General has a real challenge in particularly managing the relationship with Washington, which is a place that does command armies and does levy taxes and all of that. And, you know, the Kosovo was one of those moments where the relationship, I think, was really strained, and he experienced that as an undersecretary, right? But then going forward, you know, there's many other, including in responsibility to protect going forward. And I wonder what lessons you could take away from, you know, his time in office, and even coming up through the ranks in managing that really difficult relationship.
The relationship, of course, between a Secretary-General and any Secretary-General with Washington, the United States, which is a permanent member of the Security Council, a superpower, and contributes the greatest amount to the UN budget, and of course the UN, right here in this city, the headquarters, here in the United States, is one which is fraught with ideological and partisan fervor. And Kofi Annan was Secretary-General at the time, the unipolar moment when the United States dominated world affairs. And it was of necessity that at a time of American hegemony, he had to have a working relationship with Washington while not alienating the other members of the United Nations. And he also had, when he became Secretary-General, the task of restoring relations between the UN Secretariat and Washington, which had been very difficult during the previous 5 years, and also to begin to persuade the United States to pay its huge arrears, which was over $1 billion, $1.3 billion, when it became Secretary-General. And the UN was close to bankruptcy. And Kofi Annan used his exceptional diplomatic talents to navigate this very difficult political environment, and ultimately got the United States to pay its arrears. And his task was to make the argument as to why U.S. leadership was critical for the United Nations, but why an effective United Nations was also in America's national interest. And that managing that relationship, I think, highlights one of the critical tasks of a Secretary-General, because it is like a tightrope walk. and being Secretary-General demands remarkable diplomatic skill and acuity, which Annan had in spades. And he had also, of course, had his part of his undergraduate training in the United States at Macalester College. He also studied at MIT at the Sloan School of Management, so he understood the United States. He had been here as a student, but he navigated that relationship quite successfully. It was when during the Iraq War that it became very difficult, particularly because he tried to persuade the George W. Bush administration unsuccessfully not to carry out an invasion of Iraq without Security Council authorization, without legal justification, and without hard evidence. And that was when the relationship became very difficult. But before that, he navigated it very skillfully and quite effectively, and had very good and harmonious relations with one.
Eddie, yeah.
Yes, first of all, thank you so much for really illuminating reflections on Kofi Annan and leadership. He's a big hero to many of us Africans, and I think his sense of humor was one that would light up any room. He would often say that SG stood for scapegoat, and that's the role he has always had to play. But my question is around the intersection between the personal and professional. You mentioned how, he was careful to keep his religion out of his professional life in many instances. But there's a moment where he was under intense scrutiny and investigation because of the oil for food scandal in the 2000s and the allegation that there was some corruption involved, and his son Kojo Annan was implicated in some way, but he was cleared by the Volcker report. But just curious in terms of reflecting on, his legacy and his virtue and morality and his ethics, and that instance where the personal starts to kind of veer into your professional world in a certain way, in some sense of form, destabilizing kind of what you've worked so hard to build and project. And it somehow mirrors, in the current moment, a Hunter Biden, Joe Biden situation to some degree. Yeah. But just curious about your reflections of that and how that played out.
Thank you, Eddie. It was a very difficult time for him personally, because, as I said, because of his opposition to the Iraq war. And of course, when he called it illegal, he then had to pay the price for speaking uncomfortable and inconvenient truths. And as the invasion got mired in difficulty, you had the investigation. So he immediately, of course, got Paul Volcker, a former very creditable chair of the Federal Reserve, who carried out the investigation, and he was cleared. And I said that one of his qualities was a person of great honesty and integrity. But it was a very difficult time. And in terms of what has happened in Iraq, the civil war which took place, the enormous loss of life to American service people, regional instability, I think Kofi Annan has a reasonable claim to prescience. In terms, he was sustained, I think, by his inner strengths, which he had. People always say, how was it working with Kofi Annan? And we say, I never had him raise his voice. He was not a leader who will throw inanimate objects or string. In fact, the note takers always found it sometimes very difficult to hear because it was always very soft when he spoke. He was unflappable. Even under the extraordinary amount of stress, he was always very unflappable. And he treated human beings in exactly the same way, regardless of whether you were head of state or head of government or the most junior person in the UN. He treated everybody exactly the same way. And I think that he epitomized the kinds of qualities that we would like to see in our leaders. Integrity, unflappability, courtesy, all of those qualities which I think served him well as a Secretary-General.
The qualities don't seem to have a lot of currency today, so it's sort of interesting. Yes, over here. Yes.
Thank you so much, Abe. There's many questions I'd like to put to you, but and there's lots of parallels between Kofi's time and the current challenges facing the UN and the current Secretary-General. And I knew people were going to ask you about Kofi, so I want to ask you about the current moment. And so much of what you said, and when you think about the examples that you gave of how Kofi acted ethically and the evidence for it, you pointed to innovations, reforms, governance innovation, the creation of the Global Fund, his work on human rights. And this Secretary-General is trying to do the same at the moment, his Summit of the Future and our common agenda. He's trying to innovate a great deal and is struggling. And as you pointed out, context matters. And Kofi operated in a unique context at a unique time. And this Secretary-General is operating in a very difficult time, in a very difficult context. And so I want to ask you, when we think about leadership at the United Nations, title of your book, how do we evaluate ethical leadership of a Secretary-General in this context? How do we factor in the context when we are going to look back on Guterres' term as a Secretary-General? What metrics can we use to evaluate whether he was an ethical leader in a complicated geopolitical time?
But that's the book you will have to write. And then also, of course, it's not yet over. I think the current Secretary-General has about 2.5 years left. So the story and a lot. A week is a long time in politics and long time in international diplomacy. So there is a lot left. But let me say this. I think just looking at Kofi Annan and how we try to evaluate him, one of the things when you look at the role of a Secretary-General and certainly Kofi Annan in terms of evaluating him and his tenure would be the legacy that he has left within the United Nations itself. So Kofi was unusual. He was the first and so far the only Secretary-General who went through the ranks of the UN system, where he joined the UN at 24 when he found his vocation as a junior budget officer with the World Health Organization in Geneva. And he said in his very first speech as Secretary-General to the staff, he said, working for the United Nations is not a job, it is a calling. And it was not a rhetorical flourish, it was a deeply held credo for Kofi Annan. So, and he had spent his entire working life with the UN. So working for the UN was a calling. And the position of Secretary-General deepened that commitment to the ideals of the organization. In terms of his legacy, I think you would evaluate it by looking at the changes that he brought about, enduring changes to make the UN work more effectively. So, for example, the peace-building architecture, which the UN now has. When he became Secretary-General, there was this gaping hole in the UN system, and you could see empirically that countries which had been in war usually would revert into conflict about 5 years or so, because it's always a conflict which has had a country which has had conflict before is always at a greater risk. And so because of his leadership, he established a peace-building architecture comprising the Peace-Building Commission, the Peace-Building Support Office, and the Peace-Building Fund, which he established as Secretary-General. Not easy at all to do. As you know, sometimes these things look easy in retrospect. No, they're not easy. But the architecture. He also, I think I mentioned earlier on, the Democracy Fund, which he established, because he understood that while democracy should be homegrown, it can benefit from international assistance, and that is still there. I also mentioned the Human Rights Council. The other, I think, just example that I would give is that he was the Secretary-General, the first Secretary-General who recognized and had the courage to say, I need a Deputy Secretary-General. None of his predecessors had accomplished it. We accept this now as a norm. But it was Kofi Annan who said we need a Deputy Secretary-General and persuaded the General Assembly to approve the post of the Deputy Secretary-General, because I think he had maybe over 30 or 40 people reporting directly to him. A Secretary-General has these roles, political, diplomatic, administrative. He said, need somebody to help. And that is still there. And in governments, it is sort of the norm that you have a cabinet. The UN never had a cabinet before Kofi Annan, and it was him who established the senior management group, which brought the senior officials around the table on a weekly basis, and those who were not in cabinet would be brought in if issues under their bailiwick was being reformed. So I think you would evaluate a Secretary-General by looking in terms of the organization, how they've improved the organization and the enduring changes that they have made. I think another way, of course, in terms of the assessment, would look, of course, of how they've dealt with the challenges that they faced. And we've discussed already some of the challenges, the Millennium Development Goals, HIV/AIDS that he dealt with. He also was very active on conflict prevention. He articulated what conflict prevention can and should mean in practice. So one of the examples was, because of his patient mediation over a number of years, he actually was able to prevent conflict between Nigeria and Cameroon over the Bakassi Peninsula, which was a contested area. It didn't make the headlines, but this could have brought Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa, regional hegemon, into a war with Cameroon. And so this, I think, is an example of leadership, because global leadership is not always about dealing with the headline, grabbing disputes. He could recognize that that dispute of the Bakassi Peninsula, which did not make the headlines, needed engagement by a Secretary-General. So looking at the issues, looking at the enduring changes, I think some of the ways you would evaluate the role of the Secretary-General.
Okay. Yes, over here. Do we have two? Yes. Why don't we take them in both, and then we'll wrap up.
Can give you the last question.
Yes.
No, go ahead.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Abby.
It's very nice to see you.
Likewise. Now, I know, wearing my UNHCR hat, I have to recall that Kofi started as a human resources officer in UNHCR. Now, I wonder how much, that humanitarian perspective kept with him as the Secretary-General. And what I mean by humanitarian perspective is really the imperative of saving lives. Maybe I would say over and above the imperative of the normative framework. A certain balancing act always needed to make sure that you prioritize the saving and alleviating suffering of people, whilst to the extent possible maintaining the priority of the normative framework. Now, the other point I wanted to make was a little bit picking up on the previous comment, because, the bully pulpit, I think Kofi used it
super effectively. I think he probably was inspired to a great degree by Dag Hammarskjöld, who kind of, in a way, really used that as well. But I mean, I think the times were hugely different from where they are now. I think this was post-fall of the Berlin Wall. I think there was a real faith in multilateralism and what it could do, and the UN had a certain image that I think now it is struggling, especially post-Libya. Since we talk about Kosovo, I think we can talk about Libya, where really I think the responsibility to protect met to a great degree its end, and now we're still paying off the debt of that. And now the current Secretary-General finds himself with a certain, gridlock amongst member states and, a certain lack of faith maybe in what multilateralism can do. And so we see also, and I mean, I think we have to give all credit to the Secretary-General on the way he's trying to push for, some kind of resolution to what's happening in Gaza. But the bully pulpit can only get you so far in the current context.
Thank you so much for your remarks, and very much looking forward to reading the book. We have talked about a myriad of conflicts, and there was another one on the 24th of February 2022, of course, Ukraine, and the war is still unfortunately ongoing. And I wanted to ask a forward-gazing question about the role of the Secretary-General when it comes to dealing with the atrocities that are conducted by a P5 member state that on the one hand is a P5 member state, and there is nothing one can do. This is the Security Council that has been talking about reform, but we haven't really seen any major reform that would rethink about how we think about P5 and perhaps even growing that number in terms of the permanent membership. But what can the Secretary do in this day and age? Obviously, the current Secretary-General has been dealt very, very difficult and complicated cards, and he is doing the very best he can on the one hand. On the other hand, some could argue, including those who are directly involved in the conflict on the other side, such as the Ukrainians, that perhaps not enough is being done because Russia has that P5 veto power. And therefore, we are going around in circles a little bit when we talk about the resolutions, other resolutions not pertaining to Ukraine that get vetoed by Russia, China, etc. So how do you envision a 21st century Secretary-General when we're talking about not just conflicts, but outright wars that are at the brink of turning into something much bigger, because the escalation risk is only growing, and this is not an isolated conflict, and neither is, of course, the Middle East conflict that is an isolated one that could not spill over because, of course, the risks are rising. Thank you very much.
Right. Two very easy questions. Where is Kofi Annan? I think, and first one about, it's a very an excellent question on tone in which we started, because, as I said at the outset, the alleviation of human suffering was a key element of Kofi Annan's framework. And this, I think, really drove him, whether in terms of the Millennium Development Goals, whether in terms of dealing with HIV/AIDS, whether in terms of prevention of conflict. He was trying to alleviate human suffering and to make the world a more peaceful and a more just place for people. And that stayed with him from the very beginning, from his early days at the World Health Organization, with UNHCR as Under Secretary-General for Peacekeeping and as Secretary-General. And I think that was very much a part of his worldview and drove me ethically. In terms of the current situation and the difficulties, the Security Council and the P5 and the veto is the reality of the system which we have. I think if Kofi Annan put a huge primacy on conflict prevention. In fact, he tried to move the United Nations from what he called a culture of reaction to a culture of prevention. And he articulated what this should, and can mean in practice. So much better to deal with conflicts before they have erupted and to work behind the scenes before conflicts actually erupt, because once they've erupted, they're very, very difficult to solve. But I do think that looking at his tenure, the emphasis on conflict prevention, if it fails, then he was a great believer, of course, in diplomacy and in the power of diplomacy and using the good offices of the Secretary-General. There were very difficult conflicts in Afghanistan, for example, that he dealt with. We talked about Iraq. He used his good offices. It wasn't very easy to persuade Indonesia, and very difficult to have a consultation and a plebiscite on East Timor, and to persuade Indonesia to accept international peacekeepers led by the Australians into East Timor and to shepherd the independence of East Timor. So using your good offices as a Secretary-General robustly, and then trying to bring about key players who can help to fund a solution, because it takes creativity, it takes your good office, it takes hard work, and to identify, of course, the common interest and to build upon it. But let me just say this at the end, that great powers, and I think that was one of the strengths, as Secretary-General, and for Kofi Annan, had over a number of years had got the trust and the confidence of the P5. And because he had got the trust and the confidence of the P5, he had leeway to do certain things that his predecessors and perhaps his successors weren't able to do. And if the P5 have trust and confidence in a Secretary-General, your ability, your impartiality, your capacity to work with them, then it makes a huge difference. Trust is the oil that lubricates international relationships. It takes time to develop. It is intensely personal. And Kofi Annan was able to develop that trust with it inside. You have the final?
Thank you, Abi. Well, you all know the old saying, what is it, in writing, show, don't tell. No, this is just a great example of just, the example of Kofi Annan's leadership at a time where we're all looking for what those qualities are and what they should be. This is a great example in and of itself. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing very much.
Thank you very much.
Your book is well launched.